then raise in section 6 a few objections. See how fair-minded I am. These are objections that have been thrown at me when I've talked on this subject on several occasions. And then I'm going to answer the objections in section 7. And then I'd love to take questions from you. Let me start, first of all, by asking what kind of a book Mark is. What's the genre of Mark? If you go into Blackwell's and pick up a slim hardback volume with high-quality paper and only a few words on a page, and rather overpriced, you will say to yourself, poetry. That's the form, isn't it? Now, if you ask, what sort of a book is Mark? Well, Matthew and Luke and John are standard books in the ancient world. They're all the same length, and the length is dictated by the papyrus scroll that they would have bought in a paper shop. Now, a papyrus, I haven't got one, it's his kitchen towel. It is 30 feet long, you see. There it is. And you start here, and you go on writing until you get to the end, and then you stop. There you are, 30 feet. Difficult to handle, this kind of book, isn't it? You've got to unroll it in one hand and roll it up in the other hand. And there it is. I'll leave you the kitchen towel. Now, Mark's Gospel, curiously, is only half the length of one of those. It's only half the length. And a number of scholars think that the reason for that is that Mark didn't write it in a scroll at all, but in one of these, which we call a codex, but it's just an ordinary book in our terminology. And one of the advantages of a codex is that you can write on both sides of the page. So you can put much more text in a smaller size. It's also, as you can see, much easier to carry about. It's highly portable. The disadvantage of the codex is in the ancient world, proper literature was written on a scroll. This sort of book was only used for commercial purposes. It's rather sub-literary. Huh? So it has the sort of connotation. Do you remember when paperbacks first came out? Well, maybe not. But the paperback was looked down upon as an inferior way of presenting literature. For a long while, until of course paperbacks then moved up the social scale and now are perfectly acceptable. So Mark's Gospel probably looked like this. It's a handbook, portable, easily carried around, but sub-literary. If you ask what kind of a book is Mark, the answer I've given on the sheet is it's a handbook of preaching expressed through the medium of the remembered story of Jesus, his short public career and his death. In its written form, when Mark decided to produce one of these, the Gospel was an innovation. There were no Gospels before Mark in written form, though preaching through oral storytelling was probably widespread. That was normal. What was abnormal was to write it down. As with Paul's epistles, the missionary imperative was the stimulus for the production of new Christian literature. Portable, you see, easily carried around. Stick it in your pocket, it's a handbook. Mark's Gospel arose directly out of oral tradition. If you read it through, you can hear oral forms coming through. It directly arose from oral tradition. More importantly, it was intended for popular oral performance. Not that people would buy a copy of this, but simply that the preacher would recite it. So Mark's audience would hear the book. They wouldn't have a copy of their own. Its loose episodic texture, that's to say one thing follows another without an awful lot of connection in terms of time and place between the incidents, its loose episodic texture allows for performances of different kinds. The performer could stop and explain or add a little extra detail or whatever without particularly interrupting the storyline. There is a mention of the reader in Mark in chapter 13 verse 14.
When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. And you shouldn't understand this as an individual with a copy of Mark's Gospel on his lap or her lap. The reader is the performer, the lector, who's got one of these and is reciting it. So much for the genre of Mark. The date and place of origin, very quickly. Most scholars think that Mark's Gospel, the first Gospel, was produced around the time of the destruction of the Temple. That's in AD 70 after the First Jewish War with Rome. It must have been written in a Greek-speaking context, a Greek-speaking house church, we may call it, with a mixture of Gentile and Jewish members. That would have been normal in that period. In touch with Palestinian tradition, obviously, because the stories about Jesus have filtered through to Mark, in a community suffering increasing animosity from the local synagogues. That's a theme that comes out in chapter 13 in particular. That is to say, be on your guard. They will take you in front of Sanhedrins, local Jewish courts, and beat you in synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings for my sake. And influenced by the teaching of Paul. That is controversial, but I hope to convince you by the time I finish that that is the case. Now, Mark used to be related to Rome at the time of Peter's martyrdom. But recent scholarship has argued more plausibly for a location in Syria, in southern Syria. That's to say, places like, of course, Antioch, Damascus, Edessa, that is the lower part of Syria. Greek-speaking, Jewish population, quite a strong Jewish population. And of course, the Antioch was the early base for Paul's mission to the non-Jew. The word, I would argue, though, is not simply directed to the place of origin. Mark didn't write this book for his own congregation. Why did he need to bother? He could get up and recite the story from memory himself. There would be no need for a book if it was for the congregation where Mark lived. What he wanted was a book that could be taken around, portable, on tour, to nurture orphaned communities elsewhere. If you're following on the notes, we're in section 3 now. This is a bit complicated, and I'll try and spell it out later on. At the same time as providing a text for recital as proclamation of the gospel, Mark contains a series of editorial interventions that add up to a consistent theology of mission. And by that I mean an explanation for missionary failure and success. Every missionary needs an explanation for failure. Jesus' mission itself was in the end apparently a failure. He was abandoned by his popular following and even his own disciples. Very clear, that theme in Mark's Gospel. And still in Mark's day, the relative failure of the mission to the Jews was a problem. Why believe in a Jewish Messiah that Jews don't accept? That was the problem. And it was exacerbated by the successes of Paul's mission to the Gentiles. Which self-respecting Jew would want to join a club which was 95% non-Jewish? There's the problem for you. Too much success on the Gentile side and too much failure on the Jewish side. Now Mark, like St. Paul in Romans chapter 11, applies the hardening of heart theory to this problem. You know what I mean by the hardening of heart theory? That God sometimes hardens the hearts of his own people so that they reject the message of God's own prophets, because God has it in mind to produce some greater good from their obstinacy than would otherwise be possible. God is never surprised by the course of history. He's always one step ahead of it, working out how to maneuver people's rejection and obstinacy into his own divine plan. If you read Romans 11 sometime, you'll see Paul working that out in detail. He says this is a mystery that God has sent a partial hardening upon Israel in order to produce some greater good, which is the fullness of the Gentiles. And when the fullness of the Gentiles come in, then all Israel will be saved. Romans 11:28. Huh? Fascinating, don't you think? Mark shares the same view. Mark portrays Jesus as endorsing implicitly the Gentile mission, and Mark presents Jesus' teaching and miracles, as well as the cross, as stumbling blocks to those without faith. Of course, the cross is a stumbling block if you're a Jewish listener to the story. How could the Messiah end up such a failure? Crucified by the Romans. But also the miracles can be a stumbling block. The miracles are a stumbling block in a different way. Jesus was a great miracle worker and exorcist, but the danger is that you might attribute that activity to the work of Beelzebul, which actually is in the text of Mark in chapter 3. Jesus' opponents interpret his miracles and exorcisms as a sign of his working in collusion with the devil. By Beelzebul he casts out demons. And Mark responds to that by saying this is the unforgivable sin, to attribute the obviously beneficent actions of Jesus to the work of the devil. Teaching also can be a stumbling block, because you could say, well, the teaching of Jesus is basically controversy with his opponents. That's what you've got in Mark's Gospel, controversial teaching against the scribes and Pharisees. So Jesus is on the wrong side from a Jewish point of view in his arguments. What you don't have in Mark's Gospel anywhere is the positive teaching of Jesus. You don't have anything like the parables of Matthew and Luke. You don't have the Sermon on the Mount. You don't have the Lord's Prayer. The positive teaching of Jesus has been removed. All you've got is the controversial teaching. So these are the stumbling blocks. Finally, Mark paints even the disciples themselves as temporarily blind, uncomprehending, and thus offers hope for the eventual conversion of those of their fellow Jews who for the moment are in the same condition. That's the way I would explain the theme of the misunderstanding of the disciples. In Mark's Gospel, curiously, it's the blind who see. Blind man of Bethsaida, the blind Bartimaeus, they're the ones who see. The sighted can't see. Yeah. That's section 3. Section 4 is evidence for the missionary emphasis in Mark, and I'm going to continue this when we look at some passages. First of all, the way Mark begins his book, John the Baptist and Jesus are introduced in the prologue as models of itinerant missionaries. This is what they are. They go around all Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem, and they preach repentance and baptism in view of the coming kingdom of God. And in the very first scene in Mark's Gospel, this theme of missionary proclamation is underlined in the call of the disciples, James and John, Peter and Andrew, to be fishers of men. It's told very quickly by Mark, this story. Jesus walks by the side of a lake, and there's Andrew and Peter throwing their net from the shore into the lake, and he says, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men," without an explanation of what the metaphor refers to. I mean, if you heard a strange man come up to you when you were fishing and say, "Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men," you said, "Well, what do you mean? What can I do with men? When I caught some fish, we can have supper." But Mark is addressing an audience that is well aware of the meaning of this metaphor. Fishing for men is universal mission. So the theme of mission is strongly emphasized in the introductory scene of Mark's book. And I take this as a clue, and I'm going to trace it through the rest of the narrative. Okay? Now, in general, this is the end of section 4, the treatment of Jesus' teaching and healing ministry in Mark subordinates both to the coming passion. and it suggests a missionary strategy. Don't get into arguments about Jewish customs and law with scribal opponents. That'll lead you nowhere. Don't start with miracles, because your opposition might say he's doing it through the agency of the devil. Don't back away from the central message of the gospel, despite the fact that it's a stumbling block, namely the cross. The cross should be the centre of your preaching. Start with the cross. It is an asset, not a liability. Okay, now let's have a look at some passages. Unless there are questions so far. Has it been reasonably clear? It's a bit condensed, but yeah, okay. Particular passages for a closer look. The parable of the sower, chapter 4. Now, every reader of Mark stumbles over chapter 4 because Jesus says, to you, the insiders, has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but to those outside, everything is in parables, that seeing they might see but not perceive, and hearing they might hear but not understand, lest they turn again and it be forgiven them. Okay? Have you read Mark 4, 10 to 12 and stopped in your tracks and said, what on earth is that? The parables in order to obfuscate his message, not illustrate it. What does that mean? People have puzzled over it for a long while. To keep the crowds in the dark, he spoke in parables. Well, historically, it must have been the other way around. To illuminate his message, he spoke in lively illustrations. But Mark has introduced here the idea of a peculiar mystery based on Isaiah 6, namely that people to whom the prophet is addressing the message of God are deliberately, that's through divine hardening, going to resist the message. What you've got in the parable of the sower is clearly, it seems to me, an illustration of missionary failure and success, which I say is the main theme of Mark's gospel. Because the sower sows the word, and there are three types of failure. There's the birds of the air, the devil, that come and eat the word that it falls on the path. That's straightforward animosity and opposition to the preaching of the gospel. Then there are two other forms of failure. People who are attracted into the movement and then fall away. First reason, like the seed that falls on shallow soil, is and it springs up immediately when the sun comes out, it withers. So persecution, tribulation, finding yourself in difficult situations with physical violence, beatings in synagogues and so forth. And then the third kind of failure. This is the thorns, the seed sown among the thorns, remember. And the thorns represent the things of this world, riches, the deceit of riches. This is one of the reasons that people fall away from the Jesus movement, because they've got any money, then they'll have to put their hands in their pocket to help out all the others who haven't got any. So it's either the fear of persecution, or the demands for charity, or the devil itself that causes people to fail, the mission to fail. And then, hopeful ending to the parable of the sower, nevertheless there is a great harvest of 30, 60, 100-fold. Success is assured, but there's an explanation of failure. So chapter 4 of Mark's Gospel is a missionary manifesto. The disciples in chapter 4 are told that they have been given the privilege of knowing the interpretation of the parable of the sower, but the crowds are left in ignorance. So the disciples in chapter 4 are privileged insiders. But wait a bit, because they're gradually going to slip into being underprivileged outsiders. The same language that's used in chapter 4, seeing and seeing but not perceiving, hearing and hearing but not understanding, is used by Jesus against his own disciples in chapter 8. So by chapter 8, the privileged insiders have become underprivileged outsiders. And that's Mark's strategy. Because what he wants the audience to do is to consider themselves as underprivileged outsiders who are invited to become privileged insiders. Now, that's the parable of the sower. Let's move on. Now, quite a few of Jesus' miracles and exorcisms are accompanied by a rather surprising feature of Mark's Gospel. Jesus tells the person healed not to reveal the fact. The reason for this is that Jesus is quite clearly not going to use his miracles in the way a false prophet would, as signs and wonders to lead astray the elect. He's not putting an emphasis on the miracles and exorcisms that might lead one to the accusation that he was working in league with the devil. Now there is one exception to this, where Jesus ends an exorcism story with a direct command to go out and preach. And that's the Gerasene demoniac, the Gadarene, we know the story, the pigs over the hill, over the cliff, into the water. This poor man is invaded with a legion of unclean spirits. This is the worst case in the whole book. A legion at the time, in Roman terms, was officially 6,000 troops. But they had army cuts, as we have, you know. So the number of troops was probably as low as 2,000. And that would explain the fact that there are 2,000 pigs in the herd, and the demons go into each pig and they drive over the cliff, you see. This is clearly the worst case of mental illness or invasion by unclean spirits that you find in any of the Gospels. At the end of this story, there's a change in the normal pattern, because the Gadarene demoniac, restored to his state of mind, is told that he can't become a follower of Jesus, but has to go to his own people and proclaim what the Lord has done for him. Now what's the explanation of this? It's too early for this person to join the Jesus movement himself, but he's directed to go out to his fellow residents in the region where he lives and preach the gospel. Now the Gadarene demoniac is clearly not a Jew. He's clearly not a Jew. He lives among the tombs. He's not worried about death, defilement. He's living alongside people who keep pigs. Well, they can't be Jews, can they? This man is a Gentile. This man is a Gentile who is told to go out and preach the gospel. The third piece, the mission charge. The mission charge in chapter 6. It's clearly a piece of evidence for my theory, isn't it? That Mark puts the mission charge in chapter 6, where the disciples go out and preach to their fellow Jews and heal. Mark places it after the rejection of Nazareth. Now, if you know Luke's gospel from last week, you'll know that the rejection of Nazareth comes at the beginning, in chapter 4 of Luke. Mark puts it here, next to the mission charge. And the point of this is that Jesus is rejected by his own people because he's too familiar. No prophet is accepted by his own people in his own country. And that story is then placed alongside the story of the mission charge. So you get Jewish rejection, but also persistence in missionary preaching, right next to each other in chapter 6. Now, the riddle of the loaves. The riddle of the loaves. This is D, if you're looking at the text, and I've coupled it with the insight of the Syrophoenician woman. Here's a puzzle for you. Why does Mark include two feeding stories? The feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, and then the feeding of the 4,000 in chapter 8. And why put them in that order? Because the feeding of the 4,000 is marginally less impressive than the feeding of the 5,000. Isn't it? I know it's a matter of a few hundred people, but it's an odd way of putting it. Why include both stories, and why put them in the wrong order? And why is there so much focus not on the miracle of the feeding itself, but on the scraps taken up afterwards. With the feeding of the 5,000, with 5 loaves, 12 basketfuls of scraps are taken up. I always like to refer to this instance in chapter 6 as the miracle of the baskets. Because where did the baskets come from? We've got all these scraps, you see. And then we have the second take at it in chapter 8, the feeding of the 4,000. We have 7 baskets this time. And then Jesus rehearses the numbers in chapter 8, at the end of chapter 8. When I fed the 5,000 with the 5 loaves, how many basketfuls of broken pieces did you take up? They said 12. And when I fed the 4,000 with the 7 loaves, how many basketfuls of broken pieces did you? They said 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? Well, you scratch your head and say, do I understand? What you've got to do is listen very carefully to the story that comes between these 2 feeding stories. That's the private dialogue between Jesus and the Syrophoenician Greek woman. Here's the second Gentile in Mark's Gospel, in person. She wants a healing for her disabled daughter, her demoniac daughter. She comes to Jesus and asks for his help, and his reply is notoriously difficult. Let the children first be fed. It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Dogs, Gentiles. So Jesus is saying here, my priority is the mission to my fellow Jews. Yes, Lord, the quick-witted woman replies, but even the dogs under the table eat the scraps. Now we know what the scraps are. The scraps are to feed the world. The scraps are an image for the expansion of the gospel to the non-Jew. Yeah. It is interesting that Mark puts into the mouth of Jesus himself the sort of objection that Jewish Christians might have had to the continuing expansion of Paul's mission to the non-Jew. Let the children first be fed. Israel takes priority. And Mark allows Jesus to say that, and then has the very smart, quick-witted woman qualified. Yes, but even the dogs under the table eat the scraps. And one of the best ways, according to Paul in Romans chapter 11, I've referred to that before, one of the best ways of breaking through Israel's hardness of heart is to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. You will provoke them to jealousy. If you bring the Gentiles in, eventually all Israel will be saved. That's his theory. So much for the riddle. You see the riddle of the loaves. Yeah. You know, in chapter 8, verse 11, after the second feeding story, the Pharisees come and ask for a sign from heaven. I mean, Jesus has just fed, for the second time, thousands of people with bread in the wilderness. A sign from heaven, like the manna in the Exodus, you see. And no wonder Jesus reacts to this, sighing deeply in his spirit, Mark says. Not again. How many more times have I got to feed people before it breaks through that rejection, that obstinacy of the Pharisees? Are we going to have the feeding of the 3,000, the feeding of the 2,000, the feeding of the 1,000, feeding of the 3,000 with 9 loaves, of course, and the 2,000 with 11 loaves? You can work out the mathematics yourself, you see. This kind of rejection is impenetrable. It can't be overcome by direct assault. Anyway, Peter's confession in chapter 8, recognized by most as a high point in Mark's Gospel, because after this Jesus constantly turns to his disciples to teach them that the Son of Man has to suffer. Peter says, you are the Messiah, and then he rebukes Jesus, you remember, because he can't accept the necessity of suffering, the centrality of the cross. But it's interesting to see how Mark has led up to this watershed incident. He has 2 miracles before, which are rather surprising. If Mark had all the miracles of Jesus and exorcism to choose from, why did he choose these 2 with spitting in them? Chapter 7, the Ephphatha story. Jesus puts the fingers in the ears of the stammerer and spits on his tongue. Have you ever wondered about that? And then, wait a minute, we have the blind man of Bethsaida, and Jesus does the same, he spits on his eyes. So you're bound to see these two stories in connection with each other. The second, the blind man of Bethsaida, is an odd story to tell about Jesus because he's not instantly successful. Because the man, first of all, only sees partially. There's a stammering man and a partially sighted man. And Jesus has to have a second bite of the cherry, and then the man sees clearly. Now what's being said here? This is a stammering man, half articulate, and here's a blind man who is partially sighted. And so Peter is the stammerer who has half an insight. You are the Christ. But he hasn't seen the full truth. He hasn't spoken the whole truth clearly. That is, that the Messiah must suffer. It's very cleverly organized, these stories, aren't they? I don't know whether you noticed the blind man of Bethsaida. I always love this story because the blind man, after the first attempt at healing, says, I can see, but it's only as men like trees walking. You remember that? If you ask, what does he mean by that? Trees walking. Well, I mean, trees don't walk unless you are blind. That tree walks straight into it, as it were. It's a nice subjective turn round of the reality. Anyway, I love that bit. In the whole sequence of passion predictions that you find carefully spaced in Mark's Gospel in 8, 9 and 10, you have exhortations to the disciples to share in Jesus' suffering. But we ought to pay close attention to what is said in these sections. It's not a literal call to martyrdom in every case. I mean, you've got to take up your cross. If you want to be a follower of mine, take up your cross. That might be a call to martyrdom. But the saying that follows, what does it profit a person to gain the whole world and to lose his soul, is a call to voluntary poverty. It's a rejection of materialism. What does it profit someone to gain the whole world and lose his soul is a one-line plot up for Dr. Faustus, isn't it? You know? To sell your soul to the devil in return for all the things of this world. So that's a call to voluntary poverty. And if you look at the next passion prediction, in chapter 9, it's related to humility. The disciples want to get above themselves, and they're told that they must be humble like a little child. And in chapter 10, Peter says, what are we going to get in return for the fact that we've given up house and wife and children and lands for your sake, for the gospel's sake? And Jesus replies, you will get all of those things back in this age and afterwards eternal life. 100-fold reward of everything that they've given up in this age. Matthew and Luke change Mark. They say, well, the reward should come in the next age, shouldn't it? But the Mark's Gospel is referring there not to physical reward, but to the apostolic care for all the churches. Peter will have hundreds of lands, hundreds of brothers and sisters, hundreds of houses, hundreds of house churches, that's to say, along with persecutions. It's a call to missionary care for all the churches. So the suffering theme in the central part of Mark's Gospel, as it applies to disciples, refers not simply to a call to martyrdom, but to all the other aspects that a missionary has to deal with in terms of voluntary poverty, humility, and care for all the brothers and sisters scattered around the world. In chapter 13, we've got a kind of program of difficulties leading up to the rescue of the Son of Man, coming on the clouds, sending out the angels, and so forth. Now, in the middle of this chapter, verse 10, you have a different understanding of what happens between Jesus' ministry and the return of the Son of Man. After persecution, Mark refers to the first thing that is necessary, that the gospel should be preached to all the world. So there's one negative understanding of the time between the resurrection and the second coming. That's the outline of this section. And then there's a positive understanding of what is needed between now and the second coming, which is to preach the gospel in all the world. Lastly, second to last, the Gentile centurion. The third Gentile in Mark's Gospel is the centurion who has just conducted the crucifixion. So he's an unlikely candidate for a convert, isn't he? But nevertheless, when Jesus died, the centurion finally says what others in the Gospel have not yet been able to say: truly this was the Son of God. Up until that point, it's only the heavenly voice or the demons who are silenced, who know Jesus' identity as the Son of God. And the Gentile centurion is converted by this vision of the crucified Christ and responds with a confession of faith, the most perfect confession of faith in the whole book. He's a model, you see, of a Gentile convert. And now finally, the promise of appearances of the risen Christ in Galilee. This comes twice, once in the Passion narrative from Jesus himself, I will go before you into Galilee, and also by the angel at the empty tomb, he goes before you into Galilee and there you will see him. What does this refer to? Well, we may not actually have the appearance of Jesus in Galilee as a story in Mark's Gospel. We'll come back to that as a postscript. But what we've got is a reference to Galilee as the place of final reconciliation. And it's quite possible that Galilee for Mark, in this context, has the same symbolic value as it does for Matthew. Matthew chapter 4 talks about Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. So Galilee is the threshold of the Gentile world. And the risen Christ will commission his disciples to preach the gospel to all nations. Now you see what I mean when I said at the beginning that mission is being running all the way through Mark's Gospel, and it explains some of the oddities in the book. Objections to my argument. Mark's Gospel was written in and for one community. Mark's Gospel assumes Christian commitment on the part of the audience. It can't be a missionary text. Simple missionary storytelling is not compatible with a subtle apologetic for missionary failure and success. Christology is a more important theme in Mark than mission, and Mark is not as Pauline as this theory claims. I've been to several seminars, at least thrown at me at the end. And I'm going to answer them quickly. Mark was written for other audiences than his own. I've already explained that. If he was talking to his own people, all the stories would be in his head. Writing them down in one of these means that he wanted to communicate with other communities. The Gospels were not written simply from the place of origin. They were written, as Borkham says, sorry, I spelled Borkham wrong, it's B-A-U-C-K-H-A-M. The Gospels for all Christians. Now, Mark's Gospel was for mixed audiences of disciples and inquirers, in my view, not for those entirely committed already. I have to ask yourself, how was early Christian mission conducted? Well, from the evidence of Paul's letters, it seems that people brought their relatives and friends in to join Christian worship meetings, congregations. Paul refers to unbelievers who are present in the Corinthian church and argues that one shouldn't have too much speaking in tongues or they think you're mad, you see. Very good point, I would have thought. And so the doors are left open to the, quote, unbelievers. But people in the Jewish synagogue who were non-Jews, Gentile God-fearers or inquirers, made their way into the Christian worship services because there they were treated not as second-class citizens but as full members. The poor, the disabled, the mentally disturbed and other people gathered around the Christian community because there was a kind of social security network that was offered by the church. This is the sort of mission, quote, mission, that the early church conducted. And it's very similar to what these Jewish synagogues did in the Greek-speaking world. They attracted members by an open door policy and charity to the poor. So it's quite possible to conceive of mixed audiences of disciples and inquirers for Mark's Gospel. Mark for those who've heard the story before and are sensitive to its deeper meaning. Now, the first time you hear Mark's Gospel, it's a matter-of-fact story. You can take it on its surface meaning. But if you hear it for the second time, or the third time, or if you've read it for the last 40 years like me, you start to stumble over the things that I've been drawing your attention to today. And you start asking deeper questions about the meaning of it. And then you're led to a theology of missionary failure and success. Mark's Christology, this is the fourth point. Mark's Christology is certainly the most important theme in the Gospel, the person of Christ, but Mark is not interested, as John was, in producing a theoretical or speculative Christology. His interest in the figure of Christ is different. It's what I call, using a lot of jargon, an apologetic and charismatic interest. That's to say, Jesus is the centre of the proclamation of the Gospel, and it's apologetic because you're trying to overcome the objection of a crucified Messiah. So Christology and mission are not in tension with each other. They are both important themes in their own right, and they're interconnected. And Mark's Pauline features, finally. Of course, Mark is not writing an epistle. He can't go, like Paul, into the details of the Christian life in the Spirit. He can't develop a theoretical Christology as Paul does in his later letters. But he can't devote whole sections to the question of justification by faith, and he can't describe the present church as the body of Christ. So those features of Paul are not in Mark, and that's because of the genre. Paul is writing discursive epistles. He's not writing a story about Jesus. But Mark is. But given that difference, Mark and Paul share several important things together. The centrality of the cross, the word of the gospel, the saving faith, go in peace, your faith has saved you, and Gentile mission, which I've emphasized with the three Gentiles, you remember, the Gerasene demoniac, the Syrophoenician woman, the Gentile centurion. Okay, that's 3/4 of an hour. End note. How did Mark's Gospel end? If you look in your Bible, you see a shorter ending and a longer ending. Both of those are considered spurious. Has the ending been lost? Did it finish originally, like Matthew's Gospel, with an actual appearance of Jesus in Galilee? In which case, what did Jesus say? Did he say what Jesus does in Matthew's Gospel? Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. That would suit me, my argument pretty well. I'm sad that I haven't got the end, because otherwise it would be the clincher for my theory, wouldn't it? But the authentic text we've got ends at 16:8 with the women running away and saying nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's the ending. There is implied in it a paradoxical command. Here at the very end of the Gospel, women are afraid and they say nothing. They're teaching Mark is teaching by opposites, if this is his intended ending. That's to say, do not be afraid, and speak boldly. That would be the end of Mark if he intended to end at 16:8. So either way, Mark ends, as I've argued in this talk, on his central theme and purpose of Christian mission.
leave that talk, I hope there have been some scraps that you've listened to and have made you think. So, are there some questions that you'd like to put to John and further develop your understanding?
Well, I'm going to take their commissions. Was their aim to show the way that Jesus opened, or was it to make a Jew of a Jew, to make a Gentile of a Gentile, or was it actually the same thing?
Yes. Well, clearly the Jew who rejects Jesus as Messiah is rejecting a lot of his own or her own tradition. That's the expectation of the Messiah and the idea of redemptive suffering and so forth, a part of the Jewish tradition. So you can become a better Jew by becoming a follower of Jesus. I agree with that implication. You can't really become a better Gentile because Gentile simply means non-Jew. A better person. Yeah. How much you're asking how much of a sectarian element was there in Christianity? Well, clearly the followers that Paul collected in his churches felt that they belonged to a particular community. But the community had open doors. It wasn't a sect in the sense of an inward-looking exclusivist follow, but one which had an eschatological, meaning a final hope for the conversion of the world. Now, Paul is not willing to say all unbelieving Jews are excluded and are condemned. What he says is, I bring in the fullness of the Gentiles in order that all Israel may eventually be saved. So that's the opposite of a kind of sectarian exclusiveness. That's an eschatological inclusiveness. As in Adam all died, so in Christ shall all be made alive. Thanks for the question. It's very important this is whether early Christianity was a sect and in what sense it was a sect. Yeah.
One question.
When I started theology, which is something that there was an awful lot. When I started theology, there was a lot said about the messianic secret.
Yes. Thank you very much. The word secret only occurs once in Mark's Gospel, and it's not to do with the Messiahship of Jesus. It's to do with the allegorical meaning of the parable of the sower. Huh? So the secret is a mission secret in Mark, not a messianic secret as such. Yeah. I've explained this morning the references to Jesus healing people and then telling them to be quiet, silencing them, or the demons to be quiet, often related to the messianic secret theory. I've related that to the problem that miracles and exorcisms per se are ambiguous. They don't necessarily play a positive role in bringing someone to faith in Jesus. Because you can always turn around and say, that's the devil. You see? And worse than that, if you put too much emphasis on miracles, and you're preaching the gospel of Jesus to audiences, they might turn around and say, well, if you're so keen on miracles, do one. Which I'm afraid in most instances will lead to instant failure. So the references to silencing of those healed and demons are not necessarily messianic. Yeah. Thank you very much, Jordan. Yeah, I got that topic as an essay years and years ago. Messianic secret. Yeah.
More questions?
Do you know anything of the myth that the man who ran away in the garden was in fact the young Mark?
Yes. Right. That's good. Yeah. I think it'd be odd if it were, because Mark would, after all, have been present during the story of the Passion, wouldn't he, in person? And so instead of putting himself as a little cameo performance in the text, He should speak in the first person and say, I saw this and I saw that. I mean, you could say, well, it's like Alfred Hitchcock's little appearances in his film, you know. I know the theory. And let me give you my interpretation of it. It's preceded immediately by the very strange incident of the sword blow in the garden. One of the bystanders draws his sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest. And in Mark's Gospel, Jesus immediately turns around and says, why do you come out against me with swords and cudgels to capture me? Now in Mark's text, the one who stood alongside and cut the ear of the high priest was one of the arresting party. Later Gospel writers think that's most unlikely, and they think of Peter doing it. But Mark doesn't say that. He says one of the bystanders drew his sword, and Jesus then rebuked the arresting party for using swords against him. Now you scratch your head and say, well, if he drew his sword, how come he hit the high priest's servant's ear? Well, he was standing too close. Huh? And he cut his ear off as he drew his sword. So it was a close shave, you could say. and Jesus had predicted that his disciples would be scattered. And here's one, the young man, who is almost going to be arrested along with Jesus, but only just. They grab his linen garment and he runs away naked. So it's another close shave. I have a theory, and it's based on, sometime when you've got a chance, look at Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, says the Lord. Here is a prediction that the Messiah, the shepherd, would be attacked with a sword, but it would land on the man who stands next to him. That's what I think explains Mark's inclusion of what otherwise would be a comic case of bungling and streaking in the middle of the Passion Act. Thanks for the question. That's my view. Your view is actually...
my own view is how the words that Jesus used in prayer
Yes.
are recorded, specifically.
Yes.
Because the rest of his prayers won't see.
Yes. Well, this is an interesting problem with Mark's Gospel. There are at least 3 echoes of the Lord's Prayer in Mark, but you haven't got the full text of the Lord's Prayer, as you have in that window. You've got, Abba, Father, not my will, but thine be done. Abba, Father, thy will be done. See, that's the first opening of the Lord's Prayer. When you stand praying, forgive others their trespasses in order that your Father in heaven may forgive you. That's the same as the clause on the trespassing. Pray that you may not enter into temptation. Now, I think Mark knew the Lord's Prayer, and that would supply him with these references to prayer, including what otherwise, of course, would be a secret prayer between Jesus and the Father in Gethsemane. But it's informed by Mark's knowledge of the Lord's Prayer. You're going to come back and say, well, why doesn't Mark give us the Lord's Prayer? Well, I don't know. But I think Mark probably lived at a time when the Lord's Prayer was being used as a kind of sign of allegiance to the Jesus movement in secret, in case there was any Roman interference, Roman persecution. That's certainly true later on. If you look in Pompeii, you can see the wall on the wall. It was destroyed, of course, in AD 79. You can see on the wall a bit of cryptic acrostic, which is actually, when decoded, Pater Noster, in the sign of the cross. So it was used as a secret sign, the Lord's Prayer. That may be one of the reasons why Mark doesn't give it in full. But I think he's been influenced by it in the Garden of Gethsemane story. I'll roll up my scroll.
In Mark 1, 2.
I'll come over there because I'm going down. Yeah, sure.
In Mark 1, behold, I send my messenger.
Yes.
But I know what the Greek word is in Keros, Angelos, or what?
Angelos, yes. Angelos, messenger.
Keros, otherwise that would be problematic to your hero, but
It would. Yes, it would. Thank you very much indeed for that. Yes, Mark says, this is as it was written in Isaiah, but then he starts to quote Malachi chapter 3. Yeah? My messenger, Malachi, that's the Hebrew for my messenger. I send my messenger before my face. Presumably Mark thought that Malachi was not the name of the prophet, but Isaiah wrote it. It's quite possible that he thought Isaiah wrote the book that we call Malachi. And he there identifies the messenger as John the Baptist, who was sent ahead. But you're quite right, it does suit my argument very well. Thank you very much indeed for the extra help.
Any other questions?
what was known of Mark before he was an apostle?
Well, John Mark of Jerusalem, that's the assistant of Paul and then of Barnabas, was not an apostle. He was, as Luke is not an apostle. Matthew and Paul are apostles, Mark and Luke are apostolic assistants, effectively. Yeah. But that's the historical John Mark of Jerusalem. But the author of this book is not known. His name is not known. The title was added in the 2nd century, the Gospel according to Mark. At the same time as another book was being circulated in the church, which was called the Gospel of Peter. Now, Peter is an apostle, but the Gospel of Peter is a spurious and heretical work. And so the church responds, the real Gospel of Peter is the Gospel of Mark, not the one that's going around under the name of Peter. So claiming that Mark was the author of the Gospel refutes the claim to the of authenticity to the Gospel of Peter, interestingly. But the titles were all added. The Gospel writers didn't think they were writing their own novel. No? They didn't think they had the right to put their name in it, as it were. This is the Gospel of Jesus Christ, not my Gospel. You see, so the titles are later. Interesting as they are.
Any more questions? Well, just remains for me to say thank you very much, John, and I hope you've all had a very good day.
Good.